Hi there, I'm Dan Archer from Empathetic Media, and I'm here today to talk about how empathy can be generated in immersive storytelling. So, as you can probably see from this initial slide, empathy has been kind of a watchword over the last few years, both from when virtual reality sort of first came to the mass market in its fourth wave in 2014 when Oculus got bought by Facebook. And it also shows, there have been a number of different examples where the best intentions to create an instrument empathy have actually gone a little wrong. So the opening image I wanted to show here was actually a Scandinavian minister who was trying to understand, at least from her perspective, what it might feel like to be a refugee crossing the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, it turned into a bit of a publicity stunt that backfired because, as we can probably imagine, it takes a little more than the physical act of jumping into water wearing a dry suit to bridge some of those gaps. So what I hope to do today is discuss some of the metrics of empathy, some of the fundamental sort of platforms and ways that we try and drive empathy in immersive storytelling, and then some of the research that I have done both in cinematic VR 360 and then later on in sort of more fully interactive virtual reality. So without further ado, I like to bring up essentially a Venn diagram. What expert sounding presentation wouldn't be complete without a multiple Venn diagram illustration to show you really how we got here and the different sort of component parts of the virtual pie. So as you can see, we're trying to essentially, the reason why we got here was through a mixture of access to game engines like Unreal and Unity, as well as the proliferation of smartphones. So smartphones originally, started driving a lot of the virtual reality mobile headsets in terms of the Samsung Gear, and a lot, even the Oculus Quest to this point bears a lot in mind with an Android device. So some of the terms that you can see here, such as inside-out tracking, or outside-in, whether it has a installed lighthouse setup where you had tethered VR and there are sort of sensors that monitor your movements, or like the Quest, a headset that tracks your hands from sensors that are built into the device itself, as well as looking at things like augmented reality. Augmented reality has come a long way since being purely trigger-based. Now it includes things like ground plane detection and more sophisticated SDKs like ARKit and ARCore allow for further affordances than what originally started out a few years ago. So I also wanted to sort of fundamentally highlight the difference between cinematic VR and or 360 video, as it's otherwise known as, and virtual reality. And so in this graphic, which actually was produced by the National Film Board of Canada, you can see in 360 video, a spherical video is wrapped around the user, meaning that the user is anchored to the spot. So whilst it feels like they have full range of movement, they can't actually move or interact beyond gaze detection or cursors. Whereas in virtual reality, there are many more points of interaction. So there's locomotion, objects can be actually physically picked up, hands and controllers can be tracked. And in general, that I think is sort of closer to the dictionary definition of an environment that changes based on a user's interactions. In terms of the hardware, as I already mentioned, towards the sort of more affordable and accessible part of the spectrum is what used to be called Google Cardboard and has since evolved into Google Plastic, although that's not the official term, obviously, a series of headsets that allow you to swap a smartphone into essentially a dual lens system that gives you stereoscopic view, or the magic window view, where you have a phone and you can move it around and the system will update. However, obviously, a much more interactive or immersive experience can be had through now standalone headsets, as you can see here, like the Oculus Quest 2, which is probably the the A class of its kind, and the Pico, which also has its advantages. Probably the largest being that you don't have to, if you don't use the Oculus Quest, you don't have to sign up for a Facebook account. And as we know, that all the sort of privacy issues around that, I think, are their own separate debate and watchword. And then towards the higher end of the spectrum, you have things like the Valve Index you can see on the bottom right, or the Vive here with a Leap Motion sensor. So obviously that's a bit more complex in the setup. You have to have the sensors, you have to have a VR-ready laptop or desktop, and so that can be prohibitively expensive. And that's fundamentally also one of the issues around VR, is who has access and how can we be purporting to market or promote an empathy machine, so-called, when it's prohibitively expensive to a lot of the population. By way of background, I actually got into immersive storytelling through graphic journalism. So I started off as a cartoonist, and I'm still a recovering journalist. This is actually a screenshot from a piece I'm doing with the National Geographic around missing migrant miners, refugees who are under 16, who have tried to brave the journey from their original destination, often in conflict like Syria or parts of Africa, through to England. So we went through different locations here in Calais, in France, outside one of the new jungles, as they're referred to. And I've always used comics as a way of trying to bridge some of that divide between journalists and their subjects and their protagonists, and use comics in a way, sort of slow journalism, as an act of building connection and trust. Not least also to protect their anonymity, because a lot of the subjects that I interview, when they share their stories, they're highly sensitive, and there may be repercussions if their identities are actually recognized. So here you can see on my Instagram, I've sort of published a lot of these stories and sort of behind the scenes processes. So there's that shameless plug, Arch Comics with an X. Building on my background as a graphic journalist, this screenshot is actually from my first VR experience that I built in 2014 when I was a fellow at the Missouri School of Journalism, the Reynolds Journalism Institute, and essentially what I wanted to do, this was when Michael Brown was fatally shot tragically by Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. And so what I did is I went to the scene 2 hours from where Mizzou is in Colombia, and took a series of photos that I then used to create or reconstruct the same environment inside 3D virtual space. And within that environment, I originally started by using comics as a way of transporting the reader through the eyewitnesses' perspectives of their story. So everyone had a different sort of version or a different viewpoint into the event, and I wanted to juxtapose those different aspects so that with the idea and the intention that building on the sort of interactivity and user agency, users would come to a better understanding of what they thought what they thought the truth was. So rather than say X and Y happened and we can corroborate that, it was to almost put the users inside the guise of a virtual journalist. And here you can see a screenshot from inside what was the Oculus DK2, the development kit 2, showing what then I later did was to take 3D maquettes of where Michael Brown and Officer Wilson were standing and put them based on the grand jury testimony in the different beacons where the eyewitnesses were standing around the scene. So if you walked in virtual space to one of these beacons, you then saw the 3D representation of Michael and Darren in those particular locations, and it gave you a better sense of intuitively how big they were and where the confusion could arise from. And similarly, I played the audio as you watched those 3D models come to life. And so here, this is just a little animated GIF that shows you essentially, it sort of walks through the beacons as we go down the street. You can see I also layered multiple different pieces of evidence. So we have photos as well as their 3D counterparts. You can see the bullet casing here to really give you that sense of space and an intuitive sense of immersion in the scene that I think few other mediums could really construct in that moment. So this is also an example from another VR piece that I did called Beneath These Restless Skies. Essentially, we wanted to update Gordon Parks' original photo series, which looked at life in Harlem from a young African-American standpoint, and to take a protagonist, in this case, young Trev, who you can see here. And what we did is in order to update the story, we went back and revisited the same locations, but I used photo and video grammetry to essentially reconstruct the key locations in young Trev's life, the apartment where he was living, the street outside his house, and to allow the user to physically explore that. And as they did, to use interaction as a way of bringing them into the story. So you can see here as they pick up, for example, Trev is aspiring to be a musician. And as you pick up one of the CDs of his demos, you hear the audio play and you can read the text. So the idea is it's sort of building on that show, don't tell. I think a lot of people often describe the audience as a viewer, but here the term in VR is often described as a visitor. So the idea is you're physically inhabiting a space, and through the interactions, it actually will empathy, as we'll sort of dig into in a second. The idea there is that it actually drives impact, engagement, and information retention. So those are some of sort of the more tangible, operationalized outcomes of what might be called an immersive, empathetic experience. Just lastly, as a demo, this is also from a piece I did called The Room of Never Again. So it was based around restorative justice in Colombia. And having investigated the story for several years, I wanted to build a piece where the characters and the actual protagonists were at the fore, rather than the overarching sort of totalizing peace process that has been, that has obviously developed so many headlines, and not least the sort of 55 decades plus conflict that has sort of come to characterize, for right or wrong reasons, Colombia and the region. So again, having spent a lot of time at these sessions, the idea was that these sessions they bring together demilitarized FARC guerrillas as well as paramilitaries, they're victimarios as they're referred to in Spanish, and the civilian sort of who are caught in the crossfire, and they allow them to come together, share their stories face to face, and sort of embark on a process of forgiveness. And so what I wanted to do is, again, I rebuilt these casas de memoria, or memory houses, which were community spaces where visitors could go, and as you can see in some of the graphics here, there are little bitácoras or journals, logbooks, where members of the community share their memories and experiences of those disappeared or forcibly displaced people from the community. And the idea was that you become a visitor to this space, because even 15 years after this conflict has sort of died down, people are still afraid of revisiting those spaces for fear of sort of coming back into contact with the original victimizers. So by doing this and bringing this installation around different parts of Colombia, I wanted to try and bridge that urban-rural divide that still affects a lot of the country. Obviously, there were concomitant challenges in terms of accessibility. Here you can see moving through, that same idea of interaction applies. So users could pick up a landmine, for example, and inspect it as they heard audio. But most fundamentally was accessibility. So here on the left, you can see even the Policía Nacional enjoyed coming to playing with some of the experiences, which we used Google Cardboard for some of the 360 videos, and the HTC Vive, which I carried on a backpack on a motorbike around Colombia and set up in a series of often football pitches that were sort of the center of a lot of these smaller towns, with a projector, to really try and, again, address that accessibility issue. And so I think Google Cardboard and using sort of local devices have been instrumental in trying to bring that to a wider audience. And the videos are available on YouTube to watch in both English and Spanish. In terms of 360 video, yes, that was often what drove a lot of the innovation, a lot of the sort of empathy-driven storytelling when, like I said, in this sort of latter wave of empathy-driven stories in 2014 and onwards. Later, so my company, Empathetic Media, we've devised our own proprietary branching narrative system, again, taking advantage of some of the agency that I think this form allows. So here you can, whilst you're inside a 360 video, you can, there are different hotspots, and you can use the hand controllers to select different routes within the video. So you're not locked into the linear chronological sort of format of a regular video. And it allows you to spend more time on specific topics with different characters. And in that way, I like to think that we're marrying the agency of an interactive system with the ability to be escorted by a virtual guide through their immersive environments. And this particular story was around hepatitis C in particularly vulnerable communities, both amongst the homeless and within the prison system in the UK. So now we're going to get into the research a little bit. This is a link to the white paper that I published as a fellow at the Tau Center which is within Columbia University. And essentially what I wanted to do is I wanted to unpack some of the sort of biases, I guess, that we inherently take with us and look fundamentally at what this nebulous term empathy really looks like and unpack it. So as you can see here, as a shorthand to myself, I sort of made a list of different limitations or potential sort of things on our unconscious windshield that can distort the world around us that we maybe are less blind to because we see it day in, day out. And so whether it's political bias, psychological bias based on your personality type, physical bias, as we know inside virtual spaces, the height of the camera can affect how small or large or your perspective within the scene, which is something I was intimately aware of as a cartoonist, because obviously you have to draw from the perspective that you can imagine. Chronology, I already addressed that in terms of trying to break out of whether there's an order effect or a longitudinal aspect, like does more exposure to a similar sort of story over a period of time have greater impact than a high impact single exposure. And little paralinguistic things like the way that we socially interact with others. Some people prefer to keep more of a distance, other people prefer to lean in. How all of these things can together contribute to having different levels of impact on audience members when they watch the same story. I also wanted to bring up recent advances. Fundamentally, again, within a new technology, I think we have to be intimately aware of the fact that the more diverse and heterogeneous the space is, the better it is, and the faster it can evolve, and the more inclusive it will be. Recent research, for example, has shown, even in things like biofeedback or biosignals, which historically people always associate with a much more empirical, sort of objectively driven, quantitative aspect. Recent research, as you can see here in the Boston Review, showed that the way that infrared light, photosmethography, I think, that captures biosignals through the blood volume pulse, shining infrared light through that is distorted depending on the skin color of a user. So the darker the skin color, the less the light is likely to penetrate, and as a result, the more it will distort the signals. So I think we have to be, again, in the same way that it sort of correlates to talking about AI, we have to be very aware of who is designing this technology and how can they be more aware of the audiences and the impact that those differences can have. So reverting to the Columbia project, as I mentioned, there were 3 different conditions: immersive VR with a VR headset on the left, non-immersive VR with a desktop-based VR experience, so that you used a mouse to move around your point of view, and then a control group which had a printed version of a story with just photographs. And so the 3 stories that we deliberately chose, the first was Growing Up Girl, which was a single protagonist looking at gender equality in sub-Saharan Africa. The second was called Seeking Home, which was about refugees in then the Calais jungle, which has since been disbanded, but looking at the refugee crisis, and then with multiple protagonists. And then the third, Act in Paris, which was a sort of a voyage around series of glaciers voiced by Jared Leto. So there wasn't really a protagonist, but you could hear the audio. Also, a shorthand sort of for me was that empathy by and of itself, leaving aside, as I mentioned, that sort of nebulous term, isn't inherently a great thing. There is a spectrum. So in the sense that you can have too much empathy, for example, and sometimes by creating too much of an effective link to someone in a story, you can actually overwhelm them, and it will create a sort of distancing effect whereby they feel too emotionally overwhelmed and saturated, and it actually means that they sort of revert back to themselves and they see this as an experience and that they are only the audience, rather than thinking, okay, I can actually inhabit this from the perspective of someone else. So we always sort of want to try and encourage, as I mentioned before, kind of an operationalized approach to this. How can we best build on the advantages of the form and look at things like information retention, performance, biosignal improvement, rather than just say, oh, it's great to have more empathy. So in terms of some of the results, as you can see here, there's quite a lot to unpack. There were, I think, most interestingly for me was that, yes, the VR conditions did report a greater empathetic response. So I broke that down as a level of engagement and emotional investment. These were all based on self-reported questionnaires, as well as higher recall rates in terms of information 2 weeks after the experiment. So that's really what I looked at as the sort of main advantage of this form. But interestingly, there were differences or fewer differences, I should say, between the desktop and the head-mounted display. So, people often see the head-mounted display, as I mentioned, as a barrier to accessibility, and it actually showed that the desktop version actually held its own and might be a way of circumventing some of the concerns that people have that, particularly now in a post-COVID environment. I'll let you read through some of the other advantages, but other things like building narrator trust, I think, was also very important in terms of proxemics. So in the wider context, as I mentioned, this sort of what I like to refer as this 2016 virtual summer of love is when there was this explosion of different pieces that came out. We had 6x9, we had The Displaced, we had Clouds over Cedra, a lot of these different experiences that were fundamentally aimed at trying to foster rapport and build empathy between audiences and their subjects. However, as I've mentioned, there are critical aspects to this that I think now we're much more aware of, now that sort of the maybe unchecked optimism of that initial wave has sort of subsided a little bit. So interestingly, the New York Times, when they launched The Displaced, they gave away 1.2 million Google Cardboards, and that obviously can help people in terms of overcoming some of the inherent barriers of how you get into this and where you get your headsets from. Fundamentally, though, today I think we need to overcome different things like our symbiotic relationships with our phones. So I think a lot of story consumption and content consumption is casual, and in a way that runs counter to these deep, longer, immersive stories where you need 15 to 20 minutes or 10 minutes to spend inside an environment. And often that means dedicated time that people don't necessarily have in the same way that they might just get out their phone and scroll through their social media apps. Interestingly enough, TiVo found in 2015 99% of American audiences multitask while watching TV. So that's another thing where we're up against this sort of almost like deficit of attention, which I think is endemic, trying to not get people to have multiple tabs, multiple screens, which can dilute, in a sense, that sense of connection and storytelling, which is so critical to our jobs. The same goes for micro-narratives like TikTok and Snapchat. So that window of attention is ever diminishing, and I wonder at what point it will cease and we'll just, where this could actually lead us to. And similarly, there are other challenges inside immersive environments. For example, if you give people free rein and a total sandbox, there is that risk of FOMO, of looking in one place and making a decision means that you can't look in another place. And so what happens if you do feel like you're missing out or you're not following the right steps, and how we can overcome those onboarding challenges. So in terms of challenges in virtual reality, as well as many of the other mixed, on the extended reality spectrum, comfort is key, and interpretability. So can we make sense of our environment and operate inside it without feeling sick? Usefulness, what value do I get from the application? So it's not just an environment to be in, but what is the actual purpose and objective? And then that delight, that sense of wonder that I think truly great experiences can bring to people. Interestingly, when inside virtual reality, I like to think that we ourselves become the cursor. Place and space become critical. So actually, much like Chekhov's gun, the closer we are to an object, and when we see objects that are close to us, we sort of imbue a sense of importance and significance to them. So we have to think intimately about choreography and staging. And it's really in our personal space, really close to us, that is best for discovery, and action is a little further outside that, and then vista in terms of like establishing an environment. And in fact, Katie Newton and Karen Sukip did a really great investigation into looking at how, if you block off certain elements, whether it's from a 90-degree field of view or a 180 or a full immersive field of view, the effect that can have on a user's intimate sense or intuitive sense of space and story and what is supposed to be, or direction. So interestingly, as you can imagine, when you narrow that focus, you force your attention into a smaller funnel. And as a result, as I mentioned, objects seem to take on more significance because they're over prioritized from everything else. Whereas inside a 360 environment, we're more aware of other things. For example, ambient lighting or spatial sound, for example. So again, not to dwell too much on the negative, but since that big wave of optimism in 2016, there have been a number of signs that show that VR hasn't quite been able to live up to the almost impossible expectations that it was originally set out for. So Google Cardboard, which hitherto was used as such a way of sort of mediating that problem with accessibility, has since been discontinued. The Oculus Go, a much cheaper alternative to the Quest, although the Quest is still relatively affordable considering the hardware, has been discontinued. A lot of VR newsrooms have been shuttered. So, The Guardian, for example, Fusion, the New York Times, I think, has since sort of pulled back on the scope of its immersive projects and its 360 output. The Quest 2 does still remain, in my opinion, the best mobile HMD available, but it requires a Facebook account, which is quite a huge downside in a sort of, with concerns about privacy. Congresses are becoming increasingly problematized by COVID and how you can share headsets. So that's a challenge, I think, an obstacle to overcome rather than a fundamental negative challenge that is insurmountable. And, other affordable headsets are available, as I mentioned, like the Pico, but perhaps not quite in the same bracket as the Quest. So this slide, I wanted to just poke fun in the sense of VR isn't always the solution. It isn't the sort of panacea to all our problems. And I often, as I think someone who really values mindfulness in a sense of also unplugging and digital detox, sometimes we have to admit that maybe it isn't best to meditate with a VR headset on our faces, and sometimes you just need to actually go back into nature. So on this slide, I wanted to show that, yes, there are still huge affordances in this immersive storytelling space. It isn't all negative, and that there are very many things that still can be capitalized on. It's just a question of bringing audiences up to a point where those new opportunities don't seem overwhelming or inherently challenging or detract from the actual story, which fundamentally remains the most important thing. So things like the tyranny of choice, how you can onboard people in a tutorial experience that feels intuitive rather than overtly didactic, and again get around this sort of wider creeping endemic of FOMO. So I also wanted to give a little nod to Paul Slovic, who's also at the University of Oregon here, and who coined the term psychic numbing. So fundamentally, in the singularity effect, essentially looking at how our ability to extrapolate from a single person to a wider population, looking at statistics like when we speak of huge, like larger conflicts, like the Syrian conflict, for example, it's much harder, I think, for us, and so the research says, to envisage what 100,000 people's deaths look like compared to a single person's. And that latter actually might have more affect on us because it's easier for us to relate to. So this is actually a graph that looks at the relative popularity of terms like Syria, refugees, and Aylan in the wake of that very hard-hitting, impactful photo of the young refugee boy who was washed up on the beach, having drowned in the Mediterranean crossing. And you can see this gigantic spike that happened around 2015. So I think that's also, these are things that inherently as well we need to be mindful of as we go forward. Similarly, as I already mentioned, diversity and heterogeneity are so critical, all the more so when we are trying to bring a new form into being. We have these opportunities right at the onset to get away from the overarching, still extremely patriarchal, sexist, white-oriented, phallocentric, guys and gays that have been dominating traditional media forms like television and cinema for decades. So now is the perfect time to, embrace different voices from different genders, races, ethnic backgrounds, and use that really, that opportunity to broaden our own perspectives. So I'm just going to wrap by talking about some of the work that I've done, which takes that idea of onboarding as a sort of a jumping off point for then looking at some of the more quantifiable outcomes of empathy inside immersive spaces. So fundamentally, I'm looking at essentially building on those greater freedoms inside virtual spaces, but looking at the analytics generated from things like proxemics, how close or far we are to something, our own sense of proprioception, like how our bodies can inhabit different spaces and interact with different things in our near environment, and then look at also our background, that sort of fogged windscreen that I mentioned that we all have but assume is crystal clear, actually what our demographic and political background, as well as inherent bias through our upbringing and education, can have and brought to bear, and how we can try and make that more visible so that we can maybe take steps to mitigate it. So again, some of the challenges inherent to these immersive stories relate to the way that we get the feedback from them. So as I mentioned in my previous study at Tau, a lot of it was self-reported questionnaires. This leads to things like social desirability bias, what's called the shy Tory factor from England, where people who were interviewed for one of our previous elections were embarrassed about coming out as conservative followers. And then later, when the election results were actually delivered, there was a huge upsurge compared to what researchers had originally found. So looking more at biosignals that I mentioned, the galvanic skin response, heart rate, things like that, that aren't as much, filtered through a conscious filter. So in terms of hypotheses, fundamentally the idea is that there is a optimal margin of performance that exists in our own for our own sort of, every one of us will have a sort of a tailored sensitivity index, meaning that some people might prefer to be more stressed than others, but fundamentally there is a margin whereby at one end of the spectrum, with too little stimulation, you remain bored, with too much, you remain overwhelmed, and so in the middle, there is an optimal performance margin where you will complete tasks faster and your biosignals won't register as much stress. You need to be a little stressed, but perhaps not too much. So engaged, but not overwhelmed. And so the idea is to expose people to a number of different conditions and monitor what their biosignals do, with the eventual goal to extrapolating that into a situation where you're inside a reconstructive virtual environment and you're then given a series of tasks, and we look at what those changes are. And then as an outcome, if the performance is tied to the implicit association task, whether that can be positively affected. So this builds on research. This image here you can see is called the rubber hand illusion from Botvinnik, and essentially it allows us to see that when our field of view is engaged and synchronously stimulated, we actually, our sense of self isn't a sort of concrete and actually can be projected and imbued into different inanimate objects, and that's really, I guess, the basis for as a sort of a TLDR explanation of how a lot of virtual embodiment works. So you can see as well, fundamentally it's also based on what Mel Slater liked to call the presence and the place illusion, the plausibility and the place illusion. And essentially that sense of presence is built by that sense of being inside an environment that corresponds with the level of sort of physics that we're used to, and it interacts in a way that we're used to. So therefore we're allowed, we get a sense of presence, a feeling that we're actually somewhere inside this virtual environment, and act accordingly. So here is just a screenshot of the biosignal device that I used, a sort of a Bluetooth wearable that tracked, as you can see here, the blood volume pulse, which allows us to calculate heart rate variability, as well as skin conductivity, temperature, and then a sort of a heart rate in beats per minute. So this is the implicit association test that I mentioned. In a nutshell, essentially, it allows us to calculate, much like a Stroop test, our positive and negative associations with different imagery, and whether that imagery, for example, in this case, might be African American faces versus European American faces. And it allows, so it essentially calculates the micro timings that you are able to make those associations just through hitting two different buttons, and whether using a series of other images as a guide to negative and positive association. So you can see weapons obviously would have a negative association, and how quickly you can make that association and how quickly correspondingly you associate the first two tiers that you can see here with that other imagery. So in the first experiment that I mentioned, it was more looking at that onboarding experience. So I've just run this series of experiments, and we had people go through different conditions. One in the first person, where they were told to interact with a series of objects using an audio in the first person. So I think I should pick up the sphere, I should pick up this pen, I should pick up this battery. In the second condition, we had a diegetic instruction from an in-scene virtual avatar who said, you need to pick up this pen, you need to pick up the battery. And then the third condition was a pure text-based instruction that said the same thing, but just in-scene text. So here you can see a screenshot. In the embodied condition for the male and female genders, we had a corresponding avatar that appeared in reflection in the mirror. And then in the non-embodied, we had no reflection, and you just saw your Oculus Quest controllers. So the idea fundamentally is to take the findings from that first experience, which I'm going to discuss shortly, and pull them into a much more complicated scenario where the biosignals that I previously mentioned will feed back in real time into the Quest and change the level of stress inside that experience to remain within that margin, that performance margin that I mentioned earlier, with the hope that inside this second experience, where you actually are embodied inside a Muslim avatar, be it female or male, you experience a piece of Islamophobic aggression. So you're in a bus, and this is based on some of the previous, unfortunately, a few years ago, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, had made a series of racist slurs about Islamic wearing the hijab as pillar boxes, and it prompted a wave of Islamophobia. So I wanted to try and bridge that with the help of a BBC Asia journalist, Sheetal Palmer. So we co-wrote this experience, and Sheetal voiced the female protagonist. And essentially, the idea is that having experienced this from a first-person perspective, we then move into a third scene, and we look at whether you then, as embodying your own avatar, are more likely or less likely to act and intervene on a similar scenario when you see someone similarly experiencing an Islamophobic incident, and whether that reaction time will be made more likely by that stress level. So this was a very complicated sort of branching narrative original wireframe the original second experiment condition was based on. But like I said, I'll be running the second experiment in the first half of 2022. For now, I've been focusing more on the results of the first experiment. So this is just a first sort of draft attempt to try and create that ground truth, where I brought in to bear the number of times users had played VR, their exposure to immersive experiences, and whether they owned a headset or not, for example, as a way of building that sort of sensitivity index, and what that handicap might look like in terms of trying to equalize a baseline measure. I am also aware of some of the challenges inherent to doing this experiment and doing this research, and I am very happy for people to contact me and make suggestions, believe me. I believe this is very much a collaborative experience that builds on a lot of the research conducted by Mel Slater, Anthony Steed, my supervisor, Jeremy Bailenson at Stanford, amongst many others, Skip Rizzo, for example. So in terms of some of the results, interestingly, we found that, yes, the second condition, the U condition, where you're instructed by a virtual avatar, the performance time actually was the fastest, and the sensitivity level was middle. So it did, in terms of the stress level, it reflected that optimal window where heart rate was raised but not too overstimulated, compared to the fourth condition, for example, where I think it fell outside that window, and as a result it took longer. You can see here as well, in terms of the level of realism and embodiment, that second condition also had a higher level compared to the others, which you can see in the second graph here. And I just wanted to finish, and I know this has been a whirlwind tour, so I hope you've stayed with me. You can see here some of the results, early results, that show some of the absolute differences in heart rate from the mean heart rate was that collected across these different conditions, as well as that completion time that I mentioned. And in the second one, you can see the galvanic skin response, so the level of sweat and skin conductivity. Again, in that second condition, you can see is about half compared to the other two conditions, despite the fact that the temperature has actually remained similar across all conditions, with that performance time again showing that 4-second gap. And then lastly, in a sort of a cognitive load, what I think is very interesting, outside of that interaction test, there was a follow-up spatial test that we got participants to do to look at whether that whether there's a sort of an impact in performance directly after going through that experience. And so you can see here that actually condition 2 did have a higher spatial score. So based on a series of mental rotation tasks that they were given, the heart rate difference was comparable to the first condition. The heart rate, the maximum heart rate was right in the middle, that sweet spot that I mentioned, and the spatial score was a little bit higher, highest of all three. So I think this is it's been a very broad overview of some of the research that I've done. I think it points to a very interesting direction. And I think going forward, the future of a quantifiable self, I think will take us closer maybe to that ultimate goal of trying to bridge connections and foster a sort of sense of proximity to outgroups and others in a way that that first wave of maybe more optimistic but less grounded, empathetic, immersive stories try to. Thank you very much.